Hi, I'm Robert Carr's daughter, Kirstin,
And I'm former student Rich Capparela.
and together we'd like to tell you a bit about the history of a man who was a beloved teacher and more. My great-grandfather was a wise man, and before Hitler came to power, he did not like what he saw happening in Germany. So, he told the family he was going to America to obtain work so that he could eventually send money to the family for tickets to passage for the United States. He found employment in New York, and 2 years later sent tickets to my great-grandmother and the 4 children they had then. The family came through Ellis Island and settled in New York. Irmgarten Hellenschmidt gave birth to Robert Lawrence Carr on September 24, 1938, in Flushing, Queens, and several years later, my father was joined by his sister, Charlotte Carroll Carr.
Grandpa Amiel was in his youth an aspiring opera singer. Young Robert Carr most likely inherited a love for classical music from him. They would listen to records for hours together, and it took Bob away from some of the stresses he experienced at home. Until he was about 10 years old, the family lived in College Point. During that time, Bob was quite creative in his pursuit of play activities. One of his playmates was Harry Preich, who was the nephew of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox of World War II fame. Their adventures included constructing pipe bombs in the basement of their apartment building.
College Point sits on the edge of Flushing Bay, which has the dubious honor of sharing the same odor at low tide as the tidewater area of New Jersey along Route 17. The shoreline was dotted with what was reputed to be pirates' caves, for which Bob and his cohorts, it was an irresistible draw. They, of course, were certain they would someday find the treasure they were sure was stashed there. Some of these caves were inaccessible at high tide, which made for an interesting situation when the boys went out to play at low tide and were still not home at high tide.
Luckily, Grandma was blissfully unaware of these adventures until confessions many years later. Grandpa probably knew, since he was much more adventurous. His idea of teaching Bob how to swim was to throw him out of a rowboat in the middle of Flushing Bay.
Slowly, many members of the extended family began to move upstate New York, desiring to get out of the city. My father spent his summers in Pearling, New York, where his great-grandparents had opened a boarding house called Anna's Place, my great-grandmother's first name. This seems to have been one of the happiest times in my father's life. He often spent time with his cousin, Rudolph Hellenschmidt, who many of you may have had as a teacher at Bennett Elementary School. He also got time to spend with his beloved Aunt Rose, who, along with her husband Rudy, opened a liquor store next to the Carucci's Market in West Hurley. My daughter Allegra's middle name is Rose, in honor of my aunt. At the boarding house, my father, Rudy, Rose, and Irma enjoyed playing pranks on the guests staying at the boarding house. At that time, chamber pots were used and kept under their beds. When the guests went out for the day to go blueberry picking, swimming, fishing, etc., the pranksters pulled the chamber pots out from under the bed, would put sausages in the water, and dye the water green. Imagine the looks on the guests' faces when they needed to use the chamber pots and pulled them out from under the beds and thought they had already used it. All innocent fun from a time gone by.
The family moved to Wantagh on Long Island when Charlotte was 11 and Bob 16. Bob graduated high school very early because he skipped 2 grades, being Bob Carr. Young Robert attended Hofstra University and studied art history, where he would meet his wife, Gail Barton. They married in 1960. It was an exciting place for Bob and Gail to attend college, especially being in the choir with Francis Ford Coppola, Madeline Kahn, and Leni Kazan. Gail would give birth to their only child, Kirstin, named after the Wagnerian soprano, Kirstin Flugstad. Bob also loved and was proud of the dogs with whom they shared their home. Bob loved upstate, and by this time almost the entire Carr-Hellenschmidt family had relocated there. Gail and Bob decided to move there as well. They loved the artistic community in Woodstock and moved there in 1965, first living in a small cottage across from the Millstream Pizzeria. And this next story is an anecdote about Kirstin, and it comes to us from Aunt Charlotte. Charlotte writes, "Those of you who know and love her will totally understand. When Bob and Gail first moved to Woodstock, they lived in a little cottage in the woods off Millstream Road. The youthful parents let Kirstin play outside en naturel. I was visiting one day when they had moved to the Bearsville Flat subdivision when what to my wondering eyes should appear in the street in front of the house but a familiar little bear behind. Bob was supposed to be watching her in the backyard when he apparently fell asleep. Little 2 to 3-year-old Kirstin stripped off all her clothes, broke out of the fenced yard, and was happily strolling down the street. I distinctly remember her slapping her little behind as she went."
By this time, my father was teaching humanities at Onteora. I don't believe my father would have ever had the freedom today that he had then. We had students in our home for Saturday learning seminars where my father taught how to read and understand librettos. They'd listen to operas, discuss translations, and, of course, Dad shared his passion for the art. His enthusiasm was infectious, and he treated his students as adults, even giving them hors d'oeuvres to eat and, horrors, wine to drink. We had a steady stream of students in and out of our house. I remember in the 70s several female students coming to tell my father that they were pregnant before they told their own parents.
Gail would often cook international dinners for students, and everyone would listen to the music of that country, and Gail would often dress in the clothing of the country. Indian food arrived as Ravi Shankar played the sitar on the phonograph. So many of us got to attend performances in New York City at the Met. You may have gone to a rehearsal, a dress rehearsal, and then the final performance. Perhaps you had Placido Domingo come down and speak with you, since we were the only school in the dress rehearsal audience. Through those field trips, Bob gave to so many of us a love of culture, of the arts, a love for the magic of what he considered to be the best city in the world. And he gave everyone a glorious view of a larger world. For some of us, the only true way to repay that debt is to carry on his mission.
After retirement, my father became a bit of a recluse, but was always interested in hearing what his former students were up to. He was extremely proud of them always. He hated the computer, so it was up to me to keep him posted on the comings and goings of his students as I learned of them on Facebook and in notes to him on my Facebook page. I don't think he ever forgot a student, and when I mentioned a name, he was able to picture the student's face and what type of person he or she was. Several incidents involving my father's students stick strongly in my mind. My father and Alan Rosa had an extremely close relationship, almost bordering on a father and son relationship. When Alan was killed in an auto accident, I don't think I have ever seen my father sob as much as he did at his funeral. When another student, Rich Capparela, who happens to be my daughter's godfather, was the announcer for a public television program on Luciano Pavarotti at Miami Beach, my father called me and said, "Quick, turn on PBS. Listen to who was on at Pavarotti's show." I said, "I know, Dad. We have it on right now."
Bob would receive letters from students in Europe who had become professional ballet dancers, singers, and artists. He got to see and enjoy the fruits of his labors, the love of the arts he passed along to teenagers for 30-plus years. Bob read voraciously and listened to his favorite operas until the very end of his life.
Please hold your memories of him in your heart so that we can keep his spirit alive anytime we are in awe of a breathtaking painting, hear a symphony or opera that brings us to tears, or take our children to the ballet. Thank you. It is safe for me to say that it was a true honor for my father, Bob Carr, to teach you.